All right, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening. I am excited and to provide and present to you our presenters from the National Standards Committee this evening. A couple of things before we get started. We are recording this presentation. It will be made available on Delta Sig University in the coming days. I hope you all received the information that I had sent just about 15 minutes or so ago. That should be helpful throughout the presentation. I'll introduce our National Standards Committee members that are here presenting this evening: Chair Stephen Dominy, Chris McDaniel, and Emily Kendall. Again, a couple of ground rules here that we have learned throughout presenting this at the lead provincial conferences over the last 5 weeks. If you have a question that's pretty specific to your particular chapter situation, we do encourage you to connect with us offline to process through it. And if you ask a question during the presentation and one of us says something along the lines of "we will get to that," please trust that we will. We have a lot of information to get through in a short period of time, so please feel free to unmute or drop questions in the chat as I will be monitoring. And if your question does not get answered, or you do not feel that it's gotten answered, please ask it again, and we will get through that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen and Chris and Emily for tonight's program.
Good evening, brothers. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the opportunity. We recognize the fact of where we are and how we're navigating this, and the importance of this process. You play a critical role in learning and understanding. So we want you to know that we don't take this lightly, and we recognize the fact of the process that this has taken over the course of a few years in our progress to get us to where we are now. We will spend our time together, talk a little bit about where we are, where we're going, provide that background, what's updated, how the rollout process will be, and then the resources that are available to you in implementation. And yes, we recognize that you still need to finish up an academic year. So recognizing those components and how do we navigate the current process and policy while preparing for the new policy ahead. I will apologize as I speak. There's a corgi sitting behind me, so in case you see ears that pop up, I will say that she might join us. So next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the background. Where did this all begin? So it all started because a collegiate chapter made a recommendation. So recognizing that nearly 3 years ago, that the Theta Pi chapter at Bowling Green State University was like, we want to make a recommendation, and here's what the goal is. Basically, how do we shrink the number of members that are reviewing that allegation from beyond the scope of non-participation or financial delinquency? Then also looking at how do we navigate the allegations that may be based on behavior related to sexual assault, misconduct, and harassment by a member, and how do we review that process by the individuals who are more experienced rather than necessary collegiate members. From that recommendation, the board created a task force. That task force was made up of collegians and alumni members that reviewed the recommendation. We looked at different scopes and concepts of this. We also brought in members and brothers from higher education, DEI, and conduct to help us think through this and how do we adapt this in the direction that we need to go. So we want this to be more closely aligned with our campus partners, particularly around the concept of terminology and philosophy. And as we navigated the adaptation is like looking at the fact of how do we implement a plan that's going to help our members and creating behavior changes rather than necessarily being punitive. Also looking at our resources and what are we providing and how do we develop the right experience for our brothers. Also looking at, in that process, looking at how we are reviewing and resolving cases. Again, we looked at streamlining and how do we navigate those. So from the accusation period or being accused to how do you accept responsibility for your actions and take responsibility and how those outcomes are very much focused, like I mentioned earlier, on the behavioral framework rather than one that's punitive. So let's jump into what's been updated. There's been a couple of different philosophies that have been updated. The first one, in trying to minimize the number of members that we expel annually. If you look specifically at the 2021-2022 academic year, 61% of all trials resulted in expulsions of a member. That ended up being a little over 700 members for a variety of reasons that left the organization. So thinking about that, the updated process moves us closer to thinking about what practices do campuses use and the restorative justice framework, particularly the practice, and then identifying those issues and how can we address specific scenarios or circumstances to help equip our collegiate members through those processes, while also how do we focus again on the frames of looking at sexual harassment, misconduct, and assault. The process moves us through issues to be reviewed to the provincial committee and instead of collegiate chapters. So it's allowing for more educated brothers to review the subjects. Again, going back to sexual misconduct, harassment, and assault. Terminology is also something that has changed and been updated. We had very much a court of law feel. And we felt that it was need to align our terminology to be more focused in alignment with the college campuses. So thinking about those changes, it allows brothers to be more thinking about corrective action and restorative justice, rather than feeling like they're in a court of law. And then finally, as we look a little further, is looking at our actual process. Our current practices and our greater responsibility is placed on the chancellor. The intention behind that is very much so, the chancellor is basically the keeper and safeguard of our ritual, bylaws, policies, and procedures, and the supreme law of the fraternity. So it only made sense that they were the one or the position that was responsible for navigating our accountability process. So court of law versus mimicking campus processes. So thinking about this, under our current IDP, if an individual starts an executive committee trial, the maximum time for the different levels is roughly 480 days. That's over a year to go through this process. I will tell you, most conduct processes on a college campus do not take that long. And so recognizing the fact that the updated process, including the appeals process and all the other steps involved, is a maximum of 141 days, which is very much similar to what you would potentially find on a college campus. It still may seem long, but recognizing the fact that this will help us move towards finding quicker resolution and helping create change that will help sustain our members. Also, the framework around restorative justice, making sure that people understand root causes of members' behaviors. We want to know what actually is going on rather than just giving them the out. Ways to improve or correct members' behaviors. We are designed to create an experience that's going to elevate and help change the future of commerce. So recognizing that our members should be involved in a process that's going to improve their experience while also helping them change behaviors before they enter into the career field. And then also focusing on the framework of how are we retaining members so that we can keep benefiting from our members and our members benefiting from our fraternity. And so looking at the fact of how do we navigate this and move us forward in a way that's going to help make sure that we retain our members and that we are elevating the experience to that next level. And then ultimately that chancellor plays the larger role, helps us kind of ensure the process while also making sure it's maintained well and keeps us on the framework to move forward. Now I'll turn it over to Brother McDaniel to give us a little bit about terminology.
So with the updated policy there, and as with any update, we needed to go over our vocabulary to match more of the philosophy that we have. So looking at our old language and looking at what we're going to say moving forward after July 1 when this is actually in effect. So starting with the first thing, we no longer will prefer charges against another member. Members will submit an allegation to the chancellor if they feel a member may have violated ritual, bylaws, policies, or procedures. After that, we'll no longer have trials, but we'll have hearings. So many times the word trial makes the simple process seem scarier than it really is. And hearings will be conducted for individuals who have been alleged to have violated ritual, bylaws, or policy and procedures. Instead of a trial verdict, we're going to have a hearing outcome. And then whenever we do have the trial verdict, we're going to have, instead of the accused being either guilty or not guilty, we're going to use the languages of responsible versus not responsible, which signifies some of the legalese of beyond a reasonable doubt. So just like on campuses, our updated policies allow the standards committee to discuss it with an individual, with the individual is responsible for violating, whether or not they violated, the ritual, policy, or procedures or bylaws. And then one more, it's a small verbiage change. Penalties of the reprimand, fine, probation, suspension, and expulsion will continue to exist in our national bylaws, but for the purposes of the individual discipline policy, they are intended to be behavior correcting measures. Even more specifically, fines, probations, and suspensions are expected to be accompanied by a behavior correcting measure that will assist the member in identifying ways to be better in compliance with what they have violated. So that's as far as the updated stuff that I always find very, very tricky. With new terms that will be going into effect today, or we'll use today, and that will be part of the process moving forward starting July 1st. So the basic terms in the policy, each chapter will be required to have a standards committee of at least 4 members, which the chancellor plus 3 additional members will make up the standards committee. A standards committee member can be any member in good standing and willing to complete the online training to serve on a hearing panel. The lone exception is the chapter president. The president is welcome and encouraged to complete the trainings. However, the president should not serve as a member of the standards committee. This is because there may be a conflict of interest in the event of allegations of the violations by the elected chancellor, and the president has to select a different member of the standards committee to facilitate the process. Chapters have some autonomy to decide through their chapter bylaws and policy and procedures if they want to elect or appoint members to the standards committee, or if they just want members to volunteer. Some of you may be thinking, what if we don't have enough people in the chapter for this or willing to serve? Since that is likely to be a small number of chapters, we'll provide additional resources to address that so we can get broader information out. The next is the complainant. A complainant is someone who submits an allegation. In our current policy, it would be the equivalent of the accuser, the individual who prefers the charges. So complainant is a nicer way and softer way of saying accuser, which helps us move more towards what occurs on your campus. The respondent is the other side of the complainant. They are the individual who's been alleged to have violated ritual, bylaws, policy, and procedures. We'll now have an administrative meeting, which is an updated step to our process. This is where the chancellor meets with the respondent to provide them with the information that's been submitted. The respondent has the opportunity to look it over and choose to take responsibility for all, some, or none of the allegations submitted. If they choose to take responsibility for all, the chancellor will have a form for the respondent to sign, taking responsibility. This is similar to our current process. If the respondent chooses to not take responsibility for some or all of the allegations, they and the chancellor can discuss the availability for a hearing. This is not a bargaining session or an opportunity for the respondent to plead the case to the chancellor, since the chancellor is not in a position to make a decision in that space. In this instance, the respondent doesn't respond to the initial notification or doesn't show up to the administrative meeting. The standards committee will have to move forward with a hearing. In the event the hearing needs to take place, a hearing panel will be assembled. A hearing panel is the chancellor and 2 trained members of the chapter standards committee who will review the information and hear from the complainant and respondent. They will determine the outcome of the hearing and decide the behavior correcting measures if the respondent is found to a violated ritual, bylaws, or policy and procedures. Depending on the number of individuals a chapter has on their standards committee, the makeup of the hearing panel can be different for every hearing. However, the chancellor is expected to be a part of every hearing to ensure a level of consistency when reviewing, unless the chancellor is involved. A hearing advisor is someone who will coach the hearing panel through the process of a hearing. They are not a participant in a hearing, meaning they cannot ask questions, provide opinions, or make determinations on responsibility. They are there to assist the panel if they have questions of the process and to assist in maintaining decorum of all participants. A hearing advisor is an alumni member, preferably district director or an assistant district director for the chapter. If those leaders are not available, it may be somebody mutually agreed upon by the chancellor and the district director. Another option, should they be willing, is the chapter advisor. Whoever serves in this role should be well versed in the policy and the process. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily.
All right. And before we start walking through what the process actually looks like, we want to stop and take a minute to distinguish what's in the policy versus what's in the process. The things that are in the policy are required to happen throughout the process. So as we're walking through the next few slides, just keep in mind the things listed here that are part of the policy that must be adhered to. And these are things that we've already referenced so far. The chapter standards committee, which consists of at least the chancellor and 3 additional members. The allegations submitted to the chancellor. The standards committee validates allegations that are submitted. The chapter advisors and district directors should be CC'd on notifications and communications throughout the process. Administrative hearings take place. The hearings and the hearing panel consists of at least 3, and the hearing advisor is present. So let's talk about training for just a minute. For collegiate members who are going to serve on the standards committee, they all have to initially watch a 15 to 25 minute training video. And that training is going to be good for the remainder of their collegiate member career. The one caveat to that is if someone has taken the training and then they're later elected to chancellor, then they'll be expected to view the training video again as a refresher, since it's likely that they're going to be viewing it from a different lens. And once a collegiate member is transitioned to an alumni member, that training will then have expired. For alumni who serve on the provincial or national standards committee, your training will be good for the biennium that you take it in. And if you're appointed to the provincial or national standards committee, you'll have to renew each biennium that you serve in that role. So now we'll start actually showing you the process. And this slide gives you an overview. And I know that can look a little scary. They're seeing a whole chart here, but we're going to be breaking it down into just a couple of pieces at a time. And we'll go quickly because more resources are going to be coming on this. So we'll start at the very beginning of the process. In the next slide. So something happens at the beginning and a member then submits an allegation to the chancellor. At that point, the chancellor and the standards committee will review that at their next scheduled meeting time in order to determine the allegation's validity. The standards committee is going to have 14 days from the time that the chancellor receives the allegation. And it would be a rare occasion that an allegation wouldn't be valid. Something that wouldn't be valid is if it is alleged something happened at an off-campus event during winter break when it was known that individuals weren't near campus. And I'll hand it over to Stephen to talk through coming steps.
I just want to take a quick pause to say thank you for putting your comments in the chat. We will get to your questions. I do promise we will make sure that those get answered. So, okay. Incident occurred, allegation is submitted. So in the event the allegation for conduct unbecoming of a brother are submitted, and those allegations, including information that is sexual harassment, misconduct, assault related, or the chapter does not have enough members of the standards committee trained, the chancellor must move forward with the allegation to the provincial standards committee chair and is expected to inform the chapter standards committee and the executive committee of the allegation. The provincial committee will maintain contact with the chapter president and the chancellor regarding the process. handing it over to Chris.
So if it's determined that the allegation is valid by the standards committee, the chancellor then holds the administrative meeting with the respondent. The respondent may choose to take responsibility for all, some, or none of the allegations. So in this instance, we're going to go down the easy path where they accept responsibility for everything. In that instance, the standards committee would convene to discuss behavior correcting measures. The respondent and complainant are notified of the hearing outcomes and the behavior correcting measures. It is the chancellor's responsibility to ensure that the respondent follows through. And I will turn it over to Emily to go through the path of if the respondent does not accept responsibility for some or all.
All right, so heading down that path. As mentioned before, the chancellor and the respondent can discuss some availability for a hearing with the understanding that the conversation is not binding. A hearing should be scheduled at a time convenient for the respondent, the chancellor, the hearing advisor, and the 2 additional members who will serve on the hearing panel. It's not necessary for the complainant to be present. However, should they wish to be present, that should be taken into consideration. The hearing must be conducted within 21 days of the administrative hearing. So we've gone through the hearing process, and now the hearing panel has to determine the outcome. Either the respondent is not responsible for violating ritual bylaws, policies, and/or the procedure, or they haven't violated anything. So let's go down the not responsible path first. And I'll hand it over to Stephen to cover that.
So as we know, fairly easy. It should be easy. If the individual is found not responsible, there are no behavior correcting measures needed. Both the respondent and the complainant are notified the hearing is done and over with. So then let's go down, ease on down the road to found responsible. So we'll back it up a little bit and talk about that. So they're found responsible. So in this case, the hearing panel needs to determine what the behavior correcting measures should be. Behavior correcting measures are intended to address the root issue. Again, the root issue for which the individual has been found responsible for violating. For instance, if someone missed a community service event, it doesn't make sense for them to go and say to the Career Center to work on their resume. Like, that doesn't connect. So thinking about making sure that those connect for what they're navigating. Resources will be available to you in just a minute. One of them will be a guide similar to our current IDP manual. And this guide will provide some thoughts on creative behavior correcting measures for a variety of violations. And I'll switch it over now to Chris to talk about appeals.
So the last piece that we want to talk on about the appeal process, in this update, either the respondent or the complainant may appeal the decision of the hearing panel or the standards committee to the National Standards Committee. So this is a new part where both parties can actually appeal. The National Standards Committee is the one and only appeal, unlike today's process. Appeals could be made on the following grounds: whether or not, if somebody believes that the proper procedure was not followed, if there's new evidence that has become available that wasn't available at the time of the hearing, or if there is a demonstrable bias existing during the hearing, and the hearing outcomes and or behavior correcting measures do not align with the violations. In other words, if the punishment doesn't fit the crime. So similar to what Stephen just alluded to, if you miss a community service event, it doesn't make sense that your behavior correcting actions is to go work on your resume. A better instance of that would be to plan a community service event or to go volunteer somewhere. The National Standards Committee will review the information provided as part of the appeal and may request the minutes from the original hearing for their review. They can then uphold, overturn, or modify the outcome of the hearing and or behavior correcting measures. Emily, for the rollout.
All right, rolling out. So rollout of the updated IDP and information has already begun. As mentioned before, the policy has been available in the National Policies and Procedures Manual, which is at dsp.org/policies, and it's in the discipline of the individual section since its passing. You look at the highlighted portions of the policy. Those are the pieces that will come into effect on July 1st. You'll see them in yellow. Any of you who attended a lead school this fall may have heard a couple of bullet points about the updated policy during the event. The National Standards Committee held a webinar in December for your local leaders, which will be posted on Delta Sig University in the coming weeks. Those who attended President's Academy received a few more pieces of information. And provincial leads in this webinar are the first large informational sessions for collegiate members. This is because chapters are still required to utilize the current IDP, so we didn't want to confuse chapters who may want to utilize this process before they're really able to. And what we have coming up includes, as the academic year ends early to mid-May, the National Standards Committee will host an additional webinar and a Q&A to showcase the required training for Standards Committee members, as well as additional resources and best practices to help prepare for the implementation within chapters. Our current plan is for the training materials to be available late April to early May. This does not mean a chapter can utilize the updated process, though. Chapters still have to wait until their next academic year, but that doesn't mean you can't start preparing your chapter members before they leave for summer break. If you have your fall 2023 chancellor already elected, any individual who's interested in being part of the chapter standards committee starting in the fall can view the video before the start of the academic year and start becoming trained in that process. And once we're in Houston for a Grand Chapter Congress in August, this will be the individual discipline policy. We will have an educational session there for how to utilize this IDP. When a new officer gets reported in the hub, they will receive a welcome email with information, including a link to the video about their position, and those are always available for all officers. We're in the process of updating the Chancellor Officer module so that come July 1, any newly reported Chancellor is going to get this information in that video. And we'll also shortly after Grand Chapter Congress send out to all chancellors the link for that officer training video just in case they need it. And the last thing currently planned is one more webinar in late August or early September as chapters get rolling again to walk through the policy and through the process. And in terms of resources, the National Standards Committee is providing resources to support you with the implementation of the new IDP. The resources include rollout presentations to educate members about the revamped IDP. And in addition, we'll provide training and learning modules for the Chancellor and those who want to serve on the Standards Committee. We'll also provide the updated policy guide to aid in training and rollout. And as we navigate individual topics, we'll provide additional video resources to help you and your chapter to navigate those circumstances. And so you may be wondering, what do we do until July 1? So as you prepare for the implementation on July 1st, 2023, chapters are going to continue in the current IDP. At dsp.org/policies, you'll find the current individual discipline policy manual. And if you aren't familiar with it, it provides everything you need for conducting executive committee and chapter trials, as well as how to report them. Remember, executive committee trials can only be conducted for financial delinquency and violations of the chapter attendance policy or lack of participation. All other alleged violations must be conducted with a chapter trial. And also remember, there can be no penalties without a trial. So a chapter cannot fine someone for missing an event automatically. It has to go through an executive committee trial first. And it's going to be important for chapters to resolve any alleged violations or allegations under this new policy before the end of the academic year and report accordingly under the current policy. You don't want to have something lingering in the fall term when the new policy and processes are going to be different. And lastly, continue to engage in learning about the new policy and the process and pay attention to the different opportunities to learn about it, like you are tonight, and be educated about it as you're going into the fall term. And Stephen, I'll hand it back to you.
Dun, 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 dun. Welcome to questions. So now we'll open up for questions. We want to focus on policies and procedure questions. So if you have specific scenarios, as we mentioned, are playing out, we encourage you to seek us out outside of this session. And you never know, the scenario that you provide us with might actually be a test subject for, here's a scenario, how do you navigate this? But obviously, I want to make sure we highlight the fact of recognizing that our local leadership will be educated on this, our DDs, ADDs, our RVPs, the National Standards Committee. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm happy to assist. And then our central office staff, Tyler Havens, our behind the scenes guru of all things related to this, can be reached. And then you can also email the hub. All this will get back to us, and so we can assist you in navigating this. So we're going to stop talking and allow you to ask your questions, and we will answer those for you.
All right, committee, the first question that came in, can you clarify if this process applies to all hearings for allegations, including conduct unbecoming, or is it only dues and attendance? So will 3 collegiate brothers be making decisions about conduct unbecoming allegations?
So earlier we had mentioned this, Carly, and I just want to make sure. Oops, so sorry. My notes on me just cleared out on me. Give me 2 seconds. So recognizing the fact that the Standards Committee, once the chancellor receives the allegation, will validate with the Standards Committee to make sure of what the allegation is. And so recognizing those components, and so actions unbecoming would fall into that plate, mindful of the fact when it comes to sexual assault, harassment, misconduct, that is targeted towards the Provincial Standards Committee and not the collegiate. So it would be the 3 brothers would be hearing the case. And so recognizing that the hearing, have that hearing, but recognizing that all of this is again confirmed by the Standards Committee before being reported.
So can I ask I guess a follow-up question or scenario based off of that response? So let's say a brother, overextends themselves with alcohol at an event and ends up, breaking something that the chapter is then responsible for. Given that that's not sexual assault or harassment, that would then go to those 3 brothers on the Standards Committee.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, the next question that we had come in. What happens if the chancellor is the respondent?
The chapter president appoints another person to fill the responsibilities of the chancellor for that scenario. It needs to come from a trained member recommendation. And so recognizing that it would come from the Standards Committee, recognizing your hearing panel is from the members of the Standards Committee. The Standards Committee should be trained individuals, but only 3 are necessary to hear the hearing from that committee.
All right, I've got one more here in the queue. So if you have more questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat or to prepare to unmute and ask the question. We open that up for everyone. So the question or thought that I have here waiting is, would it be considered a best practice to have approximately 1 brother from each academic year serve on the committee?
That is an interesting question. I think if your chapter chooses to go that route, great. I think there is power in that ability to have a generational difference in thought within the organization to help navigate this. But to be honest, that may not be feasible for all chapters. So recognizing the fact that it could be a best practice, and we'll actually write this one down and navigate as a committee of like how to place this. But ultimately, we just need to make sure that we are complying with what we expect from the Standards Committee and the hearing panelists.
Rebecca, I see your hand raised. Go right ahead.
Sorry, I've got a ton of questions. This has been really informational, so I just want to thank all the panelists for all of your hard work. First on this stuff, obviously this stuff can be really challenging and difficult, especially for collegiates to navigate. And as someone who had to navigate this as a collegiate, now serving, as an RVP, I think it's really great that we're not putting the onus on the collegiates, but rather the volunteer leaders. However, when this comes to mind, so when it comes to sexual misconduct, so you had mentioned that the collegiates would then, they wouldn't go through the chancellor. Those would be sent through the provincial discipline, or not provincial discipline committee, but it would be some sort of provincial committee of volunteer leaders.
So it's provincial standards committee. So there's the collegiate standards committee, the provincial standards committee, and the national standards committee. The provincial standards committee will hear those styles of hearings or allegations, and the national standards committee is the appellate source.
Okay. And then would the provincial standards committee, will those be like a combination of RVPs and other local leaders, or would it just be somebody like entirely separate from like normal leadership, I guess?
We're working to navigate how that will be, but again, we would be working with the PVPs and navigating how those are selected. We have not, that's a part that we're still working from, but it will come from volunteer leaders. But please note, no collegians will serve on the provincial standards committee or the national standards committee.
Correct. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, I am not seeing any more questions in the queue. Are there any other questions out there? Please feel free to jump in or drop them in the chat. I will vamp just a little bit longer because I seem to be my norm here on these webinars. A couple of pieces of information as we're giving anybody a last chance to put in any questions. Katrina, I see your hand and I'm going to get to you right after I finish this thought.
Well, good.
So make sure to, if you have not looked at the actual policy that's highlighted in the national policies and procedures, as Emily had said earlier, please do that. There is going to be, again, some autonomy for chapters to put their standards committees together, and that will also be available as part of the templates that we provide for chapters when they're creating their bylaws and policies and procedures. So Katrina, go ahead.
Hi, so I just want to, I think it was said, I want to make sure I understand perfectly that a district director or chapter advisor has to be at every hearing, which I don't believe was part of the previous policy.
So it has a hearing advisor. So we would love for it to be a chapter advisor, a DD, an ADD, but we recognize sometimes that may not happen. So we would work to find out who may be in the local area that could assist in a hearing advisory capacity. So we have a little bit of a flexibility piece in this, but we do want to make sure that they are knowledgeable and trained on IDP to better support the collegiate members in the process.
Makes
And
sense.
this is an additional point of information for you guys. The policy actually doesn't specify whether or not the person needs to be in the room or not, so they can do it virtually in the instance that there are chapters that are far away from alumni.
Perfect. That was my follow-up question because I live about 2 hours from my chapter, so weekdays are challenging and they like to do stuff on weekdays.
Great question, Katrina. I appreciate that. I don't have any questions in the queue. Last call for hands raised. All right. Well, again, want to thank Emily, Stephen, and Chris for their presentation this evening. If you have additional questions, follow-up questions, please feel free. Again, we're trying to funnel all of the information into one of two sources. So national standards at dsp.org will get to Stephen and ultimately to the committee and to me, or as always, hub at dsp.org. I will make sure to get that to the committee. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. be on the lookout for additional communications for when information is available. And we will see you soon. Thank you all so much.